Good morning and welcome. My name is Melinda Herring, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We are delighted to welcome you to a Center for National Interest debate between Dimitri Symes, CEO and President of the Center for National Interest, and Ambassador John Herbst, the Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. Now, we at the Atlantic Council love to team up with our colleagues at the Center for National Interest and the National Interest magazine. We think it produces some of the most interesting programming in town. You're really in for a treat today. Our debate today is a very relevant one. It's titled, How Should Biden Deal with Russia? I'm going to turn things over to Jacob Halbrin, and you are in good hands. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to hearing both of your opening statements. Over to you, Jacob.
Thanks for that generous introduction, Melinda. And we at the National Interest should thank you for helping us have a close relationship with the Atlantic Council. It's my pleasure today to host Dimitri K. Symes and Johnny Herbst on a debate over the fundamental question, which seems to be a perennial one, of how we should address Russia relations. And in the latest issue of the National Interest, which will be out next week, we have a title story called Coexistence or Confrontation. And it features pieces with contrasting views from Dimitri and John. And I would like to welcome John to kick it off with opening remarks to be followed by Dimitri. John?
Jacob, thank you. And thank you, Dimitri, as well, for printing my article and for arranging this debate. And thanks to the many busy people tuning in. I know you were busy, but I hope you had a chance to at least scan my paper, because if you were expecting a summary here, you'll be disappointed. Of course, I'll make some of the main arguments from the paper, but I want to frame the discussion in a new way so that you understand the basis for my arguments. And a very good place to start is with my favorite Kremlin-approved analyst, retired intelligence officer and Carnegie stalwart, Dmitry Trenin. Trenin wrote an important but spectacularly ill-timed book in 2001. It was called The End of Eurasia, Russia on the Border Between Geopolitics and Globalization. His thesis was simple. Great power status in the past was dependent on control and influence over land and resources. In a word, on geopolitics, which made the politics of, or the policy of empire a sensible one for Russia historically. But in the modern interconnected world, the path to greatness and power lie in exploiting your assets, starting with your human capital and plugging into the global marketplace. In short, Trenin argued in 2001, Russia would return to the front ranks of world powers by dispensing with empire and embracing its destiny as a normal nation, or in other words, trading in geopolitics for globalization. Trenin's analysis was and is compelling for the following reasons. Ultimately, military power depends on economic power, as Paul Kennedy reminded us in The Rise and Fall of Great Powers in the late 80s. Resources and land are, of course, a part of power, but especially in this interconnected high-tech world, not nearly as important as human talent and the flexibility to use that talent to create new technologies and new social arrangements. This insight is not uniquely Trenin's, but he applied it to Russia in that book. And I submit to you that it is the beginning of wisdom for anyone interested in understanding Russia or international affairs generally today. And why was Trenin's book ill-timed? This too provides insight into our topic. Trenin wrote this during Putin's very first years in power, when he seemed to be pursuing a policy like Yeltsin's of cooperation with the West. But a scant 2 or 3 years later, Moscow and Washington were at odds as the Kremlin moved towards an imperial policy in Georgia and then Ukraine. And 6 years later, Putin gave his virulently anti-Western speech at the Munich Security Conference and launched his cyber attack on Estonia, followed the next year by his war on Georgia, and 6 years later by the war on Ukraine, first in Crimea and then in Donbass. In short, the politics of empire were once again big in Moscow. Medvedev was publicly demanding a sphere of influence for Russia. Putin was threatening that there would be new rules or no rules for the international order. So Trenin's 2001 book was spectacularly out of whack with new Russian realities. And just so we're clear, what were the rules that Putin found and still finds objectionable? They were the principles enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act and the Paris Charter, both signed by Moscow. The right of all nations to sovereignty and territorial integrity, the right of all nations to choose their friends and their allies, and the settlement of all disputes by negotiations or international law, not by war. Here lie the origins of the current tense relations between Russia and the United States, and more broadly, the West. Moscow has become a provocative, revisionist power, directly challenging American interests, the world order which we helped shape at the end of the Cold War. It took the United States and the West about a decade to figure this out. But now we do, and our policies of sanctions, military support for Ukraine, isolation of a rogue Kremlin, increased military deployments on NATO's eastern flank, are doing, from my standpoint, an adequate job of containing Kremlin revisionism. These policies should be maintained, but also strengthened. We can do better than adequate. I will be happy to discuss these steps later, which I go into great detail in my paper. But there are a couple of other big ideas that we need to cover right now. First, President Putin and his close Siloviki associates like Bortnikov, Patrushev, and Sechin are dinosaurs. They represent the politics and the policies of Russia's past. They are not the policies needed to succeed in the world today. With the help of petrodollars and sound macroeconomic policies, and a certain tactical flair for exploiting Western naivete and policy weakness, Putin has created a temporary Indian summer of renewed Russian activity and prestige in the international stage. But I stress, this is a wasting asset. It's an Indian summer, not a true summer. But that is not sustainable in the long term without a dynamic economy. And here Putin's foreign policy of empire is matched by a corrupt microeconomic policies, which have led to economic stagnation for close to a decade. Stagnation that began when oil still sold for $100 a barrel, and before Western sanctions began to cost Russia 1% or more of GNP a year. That's what I wanted to lay out at the beginning, and I'll be happy to go in more detail later into things that we should be doing to contain this threat. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent introduction. And now we'll turn to Dimitri.
Jacob, thank you, Melinda, and thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I have to say it's a pleasure to debate you. It's a pleasure to debate you because while we disagree on many issues, I think that you are one of people who have an open mind, who are guided by facts, and I think it's really always quite a challenge and a pleasant challenge to have this kind of a conversation with you. Actually, I start with an assumption that today Russia is clearly an adversary of the United States, and a very serious adversary. In a certain sense, most dangerous adversary, because it has nuclear weapons and the military doctrine, which I think oblige the United States to treat Russia as a very serious and a very formidable threat. I also operate on the assumption that in many areas today, Russian and American interests really clash. And it's not going to be easy to get out of this predicament, even if there was considerable flexibility on both sides. Flexibility, which I personally do not see today, either in Moscow or in Washington. I do think, however, that there are different ways to look at the history of the US-Russian relationship. I am interested about John's quote from Dmitry Trenin. I actually was the founding president of the Carnegie Russian Center, and I remember a debate we had about hiring Trenin at that time, and he clearly evolved in a very influential and often perceptive analyst, despite how to put it, his lack of predictive power back in 2001. I also wrote something in 1999. It was a book published by Simon & Schuster, and the title was, After the Collapse, Russia Sees Its Place as a Great Power, where I predicted that Russia would be a resurgent power, that there would be a strong authoritarian temptation, and that it would inevitably lead to a major confrontation between the United States and Russia. the New York Times wrote basically a very positive review of the book, but said that in one place I was a kind of daydreaming when I said that Russia would become a real challenge to the United States because Russia would not have that kind of capability and because Boris Yeltsin would not allow anything like that. Well, today we know better. I have very few illusions about Russia, as I have very few illusions about geopolitics in general. But I do think that it is important when you look at somebody's policy, particularly at the policy of major power, to understand their narrative, not to adopt it, but to understand it. And in the case of Russia, of course, they would argue that they wanted to be a junior partner of the United States in the 1990s, but they were basically rejected, and the United States either ignored them or just had different priorities like NATO enlargement. I remember personally vividly being on a panel with President Putin at the Valdai Club back in 2013. And Putin was not happy with my description of the Obama administration foreign policy. So he interrupted me and said, but you know, President Obama deserves a great deal of credit for his overall peaceful policy and for his kind of restraint in dealing with the situation in Syria. And then there was a small dinner where several Americans were present, and Putin again spoke about the importance of maintaining partnership with the United States and reiterated his positive view of Obama. How sincere he was is obviously a different question, but I do think that they had hopes that they would be able to maintain at least a modicum of cooperation with the United States at that time. But then, as John Herbst knows better than me, he's a former ambassador to Ukraine, as John Herbst knows, a big disagreement over Ukraine happened back in 2013 and 14. One way to describe what Russia was doing is to say that they would not allow Ukraine to leave the Russian sphere of influence, or they wanted to return Ukraine to Russian sphere of influence. That's not the way it was perceived in Russia, not at all. What they thought, it was the United States and the European Union who wanted to bring Ukraine to the Western sphere of influence without any regard to Russian interests. They think that they pressured Ukraine to change somewhat terms of Ukrainian association with the European Union, but the Ukraine still would be taking Western direction. That was rejected by the European Union. Lithuania and Poland played a leading role in orchestrating that rejection. And then, of course, what the Russians see in Ukraine is a major change in government, a major change of direction, a total collapse of an agreement reached by President Yanukovych with the opposition, which actually would arrange a transfer of power from Yanukovych to more Western-oriented parties, and all of that has collapsed, and the West, which helped to arrange that agreement, did absolutely nothing, and actually welcomed that. And what was the Russian response? Take over Crimea to facilitate nationalist, separatist uprising in Donbass. But from the Russian standpoint, of course, it was not them invading Ukraine. It was the West, and particularly the United States, geopolitically taking over Ukraine and the kind of demanding that Russia would do absolutely nothing in return. Ukraine today plays a disproportionate role, in my view, in the US-Russian relationship. I completely agree that the West should not allow Ukraine to be dominated by Russia. But I do think that a kind of adopting Ukraine as our favorite semi-democracy is a mistake. I do remember how America's greatest founding father, George Washington, was advising precisely against forming these sentimental attachments not based on facts, the way the United States is building an attachment to Ukraine today. We kind of disregard Ukrainian corruption. We disregard that Ukraine does not want to follow Minsk agreements. We disregard serious problems with Ukrainian democracy. What I am saying is not an indictment of Ukraine, because a lot of things I said about Ukraine can be said equally or even more reliably about Russia. What I'm trying to say is that we don't need a morality play around Ukraine. If we are serious about Ukraine, we should try to reach an agreement which would allow Ukraine to be Ukraine, but at the same time would not bring Ukraine into NATO, which Russia is not going to allow. And one final point. This is a very serious business between the United States and Russia. Russia is a major country. Russia is a country which is increasingly patriotic. Recent pressure from the United States and the European Union on Russia created a nationalist backlash which Putin is exploiting. And I think it's very important for us to understand, if we don't want this artificial conflict with Russia to dominate US foreign policy, it's very important to have a new beginning with Russia without illusions, without affection, without any thought about serious partnership, but which would allow us to have a normal relationship with a major nuclear power at a time when the major fundamental challenge to the United States is coming from elsewhere, from China.
Thank you, Dimitri. I would first, before we continue, I'd like to remind and urge our viewers that you can submit questions that I will pose to our panelists, and you can submit them at the bottom of your screen by pushing a button where you'll see that it's for questions. Before I ask my own questions, I would like to give each panelist 1 to 2 minutes to respond to each other's initial remarks. I'd like to go to John first to respond to Dimitri's opening.
Okay, Jacob, thank you. So what began as a conversation about US-Russia policy has now become really a conversation about US policy towards Ukraine as well as Russia, which is fine by me. Look, I think that Dimitri accurately presented the Russian narrative as explained publicly. It may well be that's what Mr. Putin and Mr. Sechin and Mr. Patrushev think when they meet behind closed doors in the Kremlin too. But if so, I think that narrative is missing certain key elements and ultimately falls flat. Let's remember that this crisis began not over Ukraine joining NATO. It was clear since the NATO summit in 2008 that that was not going to happen anytime soon. This crisis did not begin about Ukraine joining the European Union. This crisis began because Ukraine had reached the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, which is a good bit shy of becoming a member of the EU. And it's worth recalling, too, that before the spring of 2013, Moscow never objected to Ukraine developing trade relations with the EU. So suddenly, in the spring, summer of 2013, this became a vital matter for the Kremlin to prevent Ukraine from establishing this trade agreement with the EU. And that's what set in motion the crisis, which ultimately led to Yanukovych's fleeing Ukraine and Russia invading Ukraine. And this comes back to the point that I made at the top, which is that Moscow believes that it has a right to dominate its neighborhood in violation of those principles which I described. And I could add as well, that, 3 of the most interesting years of my career in the State Department was being a deputy in what was called the newly independent states part of the department under Strobe Talbot. And I remember looking at the US-Russian relationship across the board at that time and saying how good it was in all spheres, with the one critical exception of Moscow's behavior in the near abroad, in its neighborhood. And the problems that we saw starting in the early 90s of a newly independent Russia in its policy towards its neighbors ultimately led to the invasion of Ukraine following the war with Georgia, which has sparked this major crisis between the United States and Russia. And we need to understand the Russian narrative. Doesn't mean we need to accept it, and it doesn't mean we need to draw our policy from it. Thank you.
Dimitri,
Well, John, I kind of agree with you up to a point. And I agree that, first of all, we don't need to adopt Russian narrative. What is important, however, is to understand that it happens to be their narrative and that they act on the basis of their narrative. And that for them, as far as they're concerned, Ukraine for centuries was an integral part of Russia. And for them, it is an existential issue. If for the United States, Cuba could be an existential issue, you can understand how the Russians can feel about Ukraine. Point one. Point number two, look, I think that you said something very important, which I fundamentally agree with. Namely, that the principal geopolitical and moral disagreement, at least on international issues, between the United States and Russia today is the so-called near abroad. I think it's very clear. And that's exactly what I was trying to say. Then, of course, there are two different perspectives. Who is trying to move whom in which sphere of influence? And if you tell me that the United States is, how to put it, is strictly a good sheriff, which wants to prevent others from establishing spheres of influence, but the United States is completely indifferent what countries are doing in terms of their choices, I would disagree with you. And then there is a question, is that former Soviet Union, is that so-called near abroad, is that new democracies and current and potential new NATO members, is that a part of American fundamental national interests? Or would you want to turn this competition with Russia into a defining principle of American foreign policy? My answer is no.
John, with that, I would like to turn to you and pose my own initial question, which is that I was diligent and took notes on your introductory remarks, and I was struck by some of the vigorous, if not bellicose, language that you employed. You talked about the Kremlin as a, quote, provocative revisionist power, which I assume you think is stating the obvious. And you also called it a rogue Kremlin. And you talked about Kremlin revisionism. And then you referred to an Indian summer. Well, is an Indian summer better than no summer at all? Adam Smith said that there's a lot of ruin in a nation. Is Putin, in fact, following the rational course from a Russian perspective?
I think the answer to your last question is clearly not. All right. I made the large argument in my opening remarks, almost metaphysical in scope, that the requirements for success today as a country is using the resources that you have, especially your human capital, to develop the country. And such an approach is what Russia needs. Russia has among the world's greatest mathematicians and scientists, yet has failed to produce a world-class high-tech company. And there's a reason for that, because you have a system of state control and corruption that makes it nearly impossible for such enterprises to emerge. This is the key to success in the world today. This is the key to economic growth, upon which military power also rests. So that's the domestic side. Related to this, on the foreign policy side, is understanding that you will enhance your power by being a good citizen in the global order. And so Mr. Putin's policies cut against this, whether it's on the foreign policy side, by pursuing this power, by pursuing military aggression rather than cooperation with its neighbors, and by not unleashing the potential of its people to develop the Russian economy. That's why, it's a very interesting fact that the second language of Silicon Valley, right, sort of the center of global economic development, is Russian. And it's an important fact that great Russian entrepreneurs like Pavel Durov are no longer in Russia. So this coming back to revisionism, I was considered an uber hawk in 2014 and 2015 when I was talking about Moscow as a revisionist power. Now it's more or less accepted wisdom in Washington. And they're seen to be revisionists because they want to tear up the arrangements that were made at the end of the Cold War. So to me, this is a simple description. And I am not calling for war on Russia. My policy recommendations are to contain it and to make it increasingly difficult for Putin to pursue these provocative policies. It's really that simple. And certainly, my language is not nearly as bellicose as language from Kremlin spokesmen or women, in the case of the foreign ministry.
I'd just like to follow up because one of the things that I found interesting in your essay, which our viewers will not have had a chance to read yet, is that you ended up with the aspiration for better relations with Russia and some kind of, I don't know if condominium may not be the right word, but some kind of de facto, maybe alliance is too grand, but unity against China. Could you expand on that?
Well, that's not just an aspiration, it's an expectation. Look, if you really know geopolitics, and I think that's not quite true of the masters of the Kremlin, you understand that if you have a major power, especially a rising power, with whom you share a very long border, that's more likely to be your competitor than a strong power thousands of miles from your border, separated by large oceans. And the point that I made in my, and it wasn't a major point, but it was a very clear one, is that China has irredentist claims on Russia. You know, right now is a period of actually not supposed, real partnership between Beijing and Moscow. And so you'd think Beijing would have a reason to at least accommodate Moscow some. But at the same time that it's pursuing this partnership with Moscow against the United States, second and third tier Chinese diplomats, Chinese historians, and Chinese media are writing stories or making comments about Vladivostok as a Chinese city. The Chinese are very, very, they define the long game, and they are setting down markers that they will cash in decades when it is convenient regarding their territorial claims on Russia. So there's no doubt in my mind that at some point Russia will understand this, and the United States and Russia will begin to work together against a rising China. We have no claims on Russia. We do have claims on Moscow's imperium. This is the point that Dimitri and I were disputing, Russia's policy in the near abroad. But we have no designs on Russian territorial integrity, despite some of the paranoid fears in Russia. We are natural allies as China seeks to carve up parts of the Russian Far East. And the very same principles that we use to defend Ukraine, defend Crimea against Kremlin aggression would be called into play to defend Vladivostok against Chinese designs.
Dimitri, I'd like to follow up with you on that, since you've written frequently and discussed this in your essay as well. If you were advising President Biden, we have a new administration, a new chance to revise Russia policy. What approach would you advise to avoid pushing Russia into China's arms, as you've warned against?
Well, Jacob, let me first say the obvious. I'm not advising the Biden administration.
I said if you were.
So I will speak strictly as an analyst without any pretense of trying to persuade anyone to implement my preferences. Let me say first that again, there may be less difference between John and me than meets the eye. I am in favor of continuing improvement of US armed forces. I'm certainly in favor of the allies doing more for their own defense, and I certainly am against creating artificial confrontations between the United States and key European nations. In 2014, as you may remember, I wrote in your magazine that the United States should be prepared to provide arms to Ukraine if a Russian military intervention would continue. My position on that is very clear. I also, perhaps even more than John, because I was born in Russia, even more than John, I kind of feel anguish over many things that are happening in Russia during recent years. And the only fortunate thing about the Russian situation in that regard that they are not trying to push their model on others. But what is important for me is that we have a lot of countries with governments we don't agree with, and America also is not quite a model of perfection, particularly these days. I think that both parties in the United States would agree on that. And I think that we need to be realistic, self-confident, but also with an element of self-reflection, and understand where the big price is. John is right. Many in China do not treat Russia as an equal power. The idea that China is seeking equal alliance with Moscow, that idea, I think, is not based on facts at all. But the Chinese, from everything I know, would really love to have Russia in their corner and to be able to count on Russia whenever it is convenient for them. Russia and China are not natural allies for many of the reasons John have just mentioned. But it just so happens that most governments, particularly autocratic governments, they consider their domestic security, their domestic stability, their paramount priority. And if the rulers in Moscow and Beijing would get an impression that the United States are threatening the way they rule their countries, then despite many other preferences, they may want to work together against American interests. And that is not certainly what we want to welcome, and that is something that we want to avoid as much as possible without, of course, sacrificing other fundamental US interests.
There's a question from Shelley Carable from Forbes, who asks, what will it take for Russia to have a seat at the table with world powers? At the G7, briefly G8, the EU seems prepared to come to agreement on Ukraine. The US, not so. John?
Okay. I think it's premature to say the EU is willing to sacrifice Ukraine for Russia, for better relations with Russia, which I believe was implicit in the question. It is true there are individual nations within the EU that would like to do that, but the EU as a whole has followed a relatively consistent, from my standpoint, not quite strong enough policy, but still a relatively consistent policy of opposition to Moscow's aggression in Ukraine. Coming to the issue of a G7 or a return to the G8, I think that's something that would certainly be on the table once Moscow ceases its aggression in Ukraine, as well as various other problematic policies. But we don't yet see a real interest in the Kremlin right now in doing that. So keeping Russia out of the G8 or reconstituting the G8 is just a sensible policy as part of, again, containing a revisionist Kremlin.
Dimitri?
Well, when Russia was invited to join G7 to turn it into G8, I wrote that this was a mistake, that Russia, in terms of its political structure, its relative absence of democracy, and as John mentioned, some of its revisionist ambitions, which were already apparent at the end of the Yeltsin rule, that there was no reason to have Russia in the G8. And John again is right that Russia is not seeking a place at the table. And that table is not terribly relevant these days. What I do think we need is not Russia sitting at the table with leading Western democracies. What we do need is to have a kind of relationship with Russia, which allows us to pursue American interests when these interests either coincide or at least don't clash with Russian interests. In other words, I am not talking about partnership I certainly am not talking about friendship. I am talking about a modicum of normalization and what should be demanded in return for the modicum of normalization from the other power is certainly less than you would expect from your allies and friends.
Peter Zwack from National Defense University, who knows Russia quite well, asks, could this summer become a hot one, particularly complicated, regarding Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe, with major Russian Zapad 2021 military exercise that will projected via Kaliningrad. We also have Belarus, making regional NATO nations quite anxious, he writes. What messaging and action should the West take on the one hand to reassure our allies and deter Russia, while on the other hand, not reinforcing Russia's exaggerated threat narrative, as he puts it? John?
That's an interesting question. Would you expect that from Peter? Look, I do not expect Kremlin escalation in Ukraine. Although it is true, we've seen an increase of fighting in Donbass over the past few weeks. We've also seen some very provocative statements coming from, for example, from the head of RT about the need for Russia to annex Novorossiya or Eastern Ukraine. But I don't think we'll see any real Kremlin escalation there. Of course, Moscow does not want additional sanctions, and Moscow does not want greater U.S. military assistance to Ukraine, which would definitely, I think both would follow if there was a major Russian escalation in Ukraine. I think, though, that Peter was right to mention Belarus as a place where things could get very interesting. Right now, you have a standoff between Lukashenko and the opposition. Excuse me. Increasing repression from Lukashenko has not shut down demonstrations. Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, who seems to have actually won the presidential elections, remains better organized and more formidable than ever. So you have a standoff. And at some point, if that standoff began to break against Lukashenko, Moscow would have some very serious questions to consider, including bucking up Lukashenko or some Lukashenko-light substitute via use of its military or police apparatus. So I'm not predicting it, but that's something we should not dismiss.
Dimitri?
I was on a Russian TV program called Большая Игра, the Great Day this morning. John knows the program. And I had quite a debate with one of program's Russian regulars, Alexei Pushkov, who is chairman of the Russian Council of Federation Committee on Information Policy. And what we disputed essentially was the possibility of Russian military action in Ukraine in view of Putin's recent statement that if Ukraine would, as Putin described it, would take reckless action, that could mean the end of Ukrainian statehood. And Pushkov's view was that Putin was not talking about any Russian use of force, that if Ukraine kind of collapses, it would be because of the situation in Ukraine, not because of Russian action. Perhaps. But I also think that when Margarita Simonyan, the head of RT, have mentioned what John have just alluded to, namely a possibility that Eastern Ukraine would become at first independent and then maybe incorporated in Russia. I think that she knew that at a minimum she could afford to make a statement like that, being an important de facto government official. I also think that there is a growing movement in Moscow to demonstrate that Russia has a way to respond to pressure, to containment, to sanctions. And because they cannot respond effectively economically, and because they have very few allies, a favorite argument is that since time immemorial, Russia had only two reliable allies, Russian Navy and the Russian Army. and that it is important for the Russian army, contrary to Putin's cautious instincts, to take a stand somewhere. And I do know that there are conversations in Moscow, not necessarily in the Kremlin, but in elite foreign policy circles, about what kind of limited military operation may be taken by Russia if the Ukrainians would do certain things first. Now, you can say, well, the Ukrainians would not do these things to start with, so all this gossip in Moscow should not be taken seriously. But all I can say is that the move in Moscow at this point is, yes, to be cautious, not to invite more ruinous sanctions, but at the same time to demonstrate that Russia cannot be pushed around. And in my view, it can go out of control.
John, we have a question specifically addressed to you from Dan Negrea, who was member of the State Department's Office of Policy Planning staff. He asks, Russia, or he says, Russia will not give up Crimea. When and how will the related sanctions be lifted? They have a major effect on the relationship in general.
Okay, that's another good question. I agree that in the foreseeable future, Russia giving up Crimea is not to be expected. I believe that there will also be no change in the American position. You know, the Pompeo doctrine that we will not recognize, we will not in any way facilitate Russian control over Crimea. Crimea is part of Ukraine. That will also not change. But let's keep in mind that the major issue right now regarding Ukraine is the ongoing Kremlin war in Donbass. And if we were able to ultimately persuade Moscow to withdraw from Donbass, and I think we will over time, the question is only when, that would facilitate, or that should lead to very quickly, the end of the Donbass sanctions. And the Donbass sanctions are the far more onerous sanctions than the ones related to Crimea. So I could easily see a Moscow leaving Donbass, so Ukraine takes full control there, exercise its sovereignty, leading to an end to those sanctions, a great improvement in US and, for that matter, Western relations with Moscow, while maintaining a disagreement over Crimea, which would not get in the way of many positive developments in the bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia. And I think Crimea will be dealt with in the long term. And if the big argument I made at the beginning of this session regarding Moscow becoming a quote unquote normal nation in the global economy, the global order, were to prove true, then it's not impossible to imagine an arrangement on Crimea, which would include its return to Ukraine from Russia. But that's for the very long term.
Dimitri, do you agree with John's assessment?
100%. And what I like again about debating John, and John doesn't need praise from me, but I still will offer it because it's sincere and well-deserved, is that while we may disagree with John on many things, in terms of our underlying assumptions and our preferences, but we are both practical people. And I think that if you think about what is achievable and what is desirable in the foreseeable future, I think John have described it very, very well. My only caveat would be that I am not sure, and John may want to correct me because he knows Ukraine much better than I do, but my impression is that the Zelensky government is not quite interested in seeing a kind of compromise with Moscow, which John have just described. If that compromise was clearly communicated to Kyiv as an important American preference, I think we could start a very important negotiating process.
Another question directed at Ambassador Herbst from Evan Sankey, who is a fellow at the Center for the National Interest. He notes that John has stated that China has irredentist aims on Russian territory. He asks, is there in fact evidence that the Russian military or strategic community is concerned by the rise of China?
From what I've seen, the Kremlin is very keen to keep a lid on any Russian anxieties about Chinese intentions. So these things do not appear publicly. As some of you may know, the Atlantic Council was named an undesirable organization by Russian legal authorities in the summer of 2019. And I've not been in Russia since, 2014? Excuse me, 2008. But I know from people who have been in Russia since then, and quite recently, that their friends or colleagues in the national security community, after they've had their 7th or 8th shot of vodka, talk rather frankly about their concerns with China. So there's no doubt in my mind that senior Russians understand that this is a problem, but for political reasons, this is something which is not discussed publicly.
Dimitri, what is your take on this issue?
Well, I think that John is right again, that there are a few illusions about China on the part of the Russian leadership. And it's not only geopolitical, it's also economic, because there is considerable frustration in Moscow with the way China deals with economic issues. There is a lot of warmth during the meetings of Chinese and Russian leadership. But whenever the Chinese have to sign specific agreements, in particular to pay, they're very, very tough, completely unsentimental about Russia. Having said that, I think it's important again to understand that for Russia, China is also a kind of geopolitical card, and they in Moscow do not want to create an impression that there are serious differences between Moscow and Beijing. They obviously want to maintain a facade of unity, but I don't think they have much doubt about the real situation. But they also do not have doubt that as much as the Chinese and the Russians have issues with each other, they may need to work together against the United States if American pressure becomes too threatening.
It's a question from George Beebe at the Center for the National Interest, who also used to work at the CIA on Russian issues. And I'll pose it first to John. George notes that there is a discrepancy between the Biden administration and previous new presidential administrations, which is that a lot of other administrations came in talking about a reset or improving relations with Russia, whereas Biden's rhetoric, George says, has been fairly confrontational at the outset. He asks further, does this in fact position Biden to work on positive steps that could stabilize the relationship between Russia and the United States? What's your view, John?
Another smart question, which you'd expect from George. Look, I think Biden has a very realistic view of what the Kremlin is up to and American interests. So, and I think we saw that in his first phone call with Putin, where he spoke specifically about Kremlin challenges, to use a very polite word, mentioning Ukraine in particular, which I think was a good thing. But at the same time, a readiness on the part of the administration to work with the Kremlin on issues where we seem to have joint interests, and in the first case, relating to strategic weapons. So I think Biden will certainly capitalize any opportunity to improve relations, but not at the expense of our core interests, which Moscow is threatening right now, including in Ukraine.
Dimitri.
Well, the whole question is what, again, are U.S. core interests? The Biden administration already is praised quietly in Moscow for its willingness to extend the Strategic Arms Treaty, to an interest in retaining the United States to Open Skies Treaty, to willingness to abide by nuclear agreements with Iran, and of course to U.S. position both on climate change and the pandemics. So if you are talking about specific areas of cooperation, they see in Moscow some good news. Having said that, look, The paramount concern, John mentioned it indirectly, the paramount concern at this point is domestic stability. Our forthcoming Duma elections is the sense that the United States and the European Union want to encourage a lot of domestic trouble in Russia. We react very nervously in the United States to Russian attempts to interfere in American politics. But very few, I know, in the intelligence community or among Russian experts, believe that Russia has a leverage to make a real difference in the United States domestically. I can tell you with certain confidence that in Russia there is a strong narrative that the United States has both a strong political influence in Russia and the temptation to use this influence against the current government. Again, that may be a wrong narrative, but that's what they think. And in my view, if they come to a conclusion that US objective is not to settle with Russia unless they change their domestic arrangements, then I think most other things would not become possible. If this issue is successfully, I don't think it can be resolved, but if this issue is successfully managed, I do think that there may be some interesting opportunities in the US-Russian relationship.
We have a question from James Kitfield of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, who's written widely on the US military and foreign policy. He asks, has Russia not successfully halted further NATO expansion into its near abroad, specifically Georgia and Ukraine? New NATO members must increase the security of the alliance, but it's hard to imagine for countries with Russian forces on their territory. John?
Well, I mentioned before that NATO membership for Ukraine, and you could add Georgia as well, has been pretty much been on the back burner since the Bucharest summit in 2008, the NATO summit in 2008. So I think that the questioner's point is a good one. But on the back burner is not the same as saying that it's dead. And there are still people, I'm one of them, who support NATO membership for both countries, because I don't think that Moscow will leave them alone unless they are in fact members of NATO. But I think that view is not very popular currently within the alliance. So it is at the moment not a live issue.
Dimitri, do you have a comment?
Well, I think that it's quite clear that today neither Georgia nor Ukraine are on track to NATO's membership in the immediate future. At the same time, NATO was careful to make clear that the door is open, and there are even some conversations about NATO being prepared to consider bringing into NATO nations which have territorial disputes with their neighbors, in this case, Russia. In my view, NATO membership for Georgia and particularly Ukraine is a red line for Russia. This is one of those red lines which Russia may be prepared to enforce using force, sanctions or no sanctions. My concern is that if Russia would want to do it, they would do it quickly, decisively, and in a way that would put NATO and specifically the United States in a very difficult situation when we would have a choice between risking fundamental military confrontation and risking our very credibility. I don't think that since the United States is not in favor of bringing these two countries in NATO as a matter of immediate practical policy, I don't think it's in our interest to maintain a false impression that there will be a NATO anytime soon. And creative professional diplomats like John Herbst, I'm sure, can develop a formula which will make certain that the door to NATO is open for Ukraine and Georgia, but it would not happen in any foreseeable future.
We have a pungent question from Christian Witten, who asks, will the incarceration of Alexei Navalny significantly impact how the Biden administration handles Russia? And does Navalny have a strong following outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg? John, why don't you tackle that first?
I'll start with the second half of the question. One of Navalny's strengths and the strengths of his organization is that they have managed to set up a network across Russia. So we've seen these extraordinary demonstrations since his arrest, again, across the length and breadth of the country. And of course, this is not the first time he's managed such demonstrations. Regarding the impact of Navalny's arrest on Russia, United States, and Russia-EU relations, I think it's very clear that it has has a large impact, because we react to human rights abuses, and this is a high-profile human rights abuse. And as a consequence, both the EU and the United States, in coordination, are looking at sanctions, and I think we'll see that. And this type of issue, I mean, the human rights issue, has been a staple of relations between Moscow and the West for many decades, in the Soviet period and even before the Soviet period. And it's a part of our policy world today.
Dimitri, what is your take on the case of Navalny and its impact on US-Russian relations?
I don't have a good understanding of what happened to Navalny. It's difficult to accept Russian explanations that they had absolutely nothing to do with the poisoning and that they cannot start the investigation because they were not provided some kind of data by Western countries. I certainly do not accept the Russian explanation that Navalny, in fact, was poisoned by US and other NATO intelligence services. At the same time, there are a lot of unanswered questions for me in Navalny's explanations, and how to put it, looking at Mr. Navalny's previous record, his relationship with truth was occasional at best. And that can be easily demonstrated. And as you may know, many Russian leading supporters of democracy, liberals, reformers, they make a very clear distinction between opposing what is being done to Navalny and really supporting Navalny. He's a very controversial figure in the Russian opposition movement, which is not to say that he should be poisoned or that he should be kept in jail. But the main point is, and here may be my real disagreement with US policy today, the main point is that Navalny is not just a critic of particular Russian policies. Navalny is a person who is saying that the Russian regime is a regime of traitors and crooks. He defines Russian regime very broadly. It's not Putin, it's not just his close associates, it's practically everyone who directly or indirectly benefits from current order in Russia. His definition of people he wants to remove, to punish, is very, very broad. And I have to say that it generates very strong opposition in Russia. And remarkably, despite his demonstrable courage and willingness to stand up to the regime, Navalny became during recent weeks more rather than less controversial in Russia. And the more there is a perception in Russia that the United States is behind Navalny, the more Putin benefits from this politically. And it becomes advantageous to Putin to stand up to American pressure because it is not viewed as a pressure for democracy. It is a pressure to tell Mother Russia how to behave and as a desire to reduce Russia down to size.
That makes for a good segue to the questions keep tumbling in. But this will be the final one from Michael Kimmage of Catholic University, where he's a historian. He asks, why has US-Ukraine policy not been more successful? What could the Biden administration do differently in order to make actual progress on Ukrainian security and domestic political reform? John?
Well, I would, Michael's a very smart guy, but I would take issue with the premise of his question. I think our policy has been successful. We have thwarted Kremlin effort to make sure that Ukraine essentially bowed to its rule, to its dictate. And we've done that by a combination of sanctions, which have placed a brake on Kremlin aggression, and military supply. Now, we have not gotten Moscow to get out of Donbass. That may take some more time. But we're in a position, we have placed cost on Kremlin aggression, which has proved the deterrent. On the domestic side, we have also not, well, on the domestic side, we have called for serious reform in Ukraine, and we've only seen some steps in that direction. This is a very difficult issue. I think our policy has encouraged the reform that has taken place. I think there's a lot more reform that's necessary, and there's also more that we can do.
Dimitri.
I think US policy toward Ukraine was a failure. I think that back in 2013, in the fall of 2013 and early 2014, Putin was not contemplating any far-reaching aggression in Ukraine. Actually, he was preoccupied with Winter Olympics, and till the end of the Olympics did not want even to do anything about the crisis in Kyiv, because he was concerned that there would be perception of Russian interference, that Western leaders would not attend the Olympics, and etc., and etc. And I think that there was a good possibility for the United States to have its cake and eat it too, namely to move Ukraine in the Western direction. The Yanukovych regime was doomed, and he pretty much acknowledged that he would be leaving power in a matter of months. Ukraine would have its association with the European Union, but with some adjustments which would address Russian concerns and would help Russia to maintain a sense of dignity in that very difficult situation when it looked like Ukraine is breaking with Russia. But the European Union, actually less so the United States, more the European Union, influenced by Baltic states and Poland, decided essentially to tell Yanukovych that no, he was not quite ready for the European Union. It was an undeserved honor for him even to be considered for that role, and he has to comply with his previous informal promises, or there would be no deal at all, and that's how this whole crisis got started. As a result, Ukraine lost Crimea, Ukraine have lost Donbass, and we have a major conflict in Europe with another nuclear power. A nuclear power which actually has much weaker economy than the United States, but in terms of purchasing power, it is still number 6 in the world, number 2 in Europe just after Germany. And to have a conflict with a power like that for any non-essential, unnecessary reasons, I think cannot be defined as a foreign policy success.
I'd like to pose a final question to each of you, and I'll begin with John, which is, John, in your piece in the cover story in the National Interest, you focus heavily on sanctions as one way to try and modulate Russian behavior. I wonder, now that Biden has come into office and Trump is gone, do you feel more optimistic about the course of action that you're pursuing, or the developments in Europe, where French President Macron keeps reaching out to Russia? In his Munich security statement, Macron quite specifically stated that Europe can really no longer rely on the United States, and Germany is pushing for Nord Stream 2. So what is the likelihood of success of the strategy that you propound in your essay?
I don't have any doubts that this policy, 1, has been working, and 2, can continue to work, and perhaps and better, because I think Biden will be a more reliable steward of our policy than Trump was. The specific things you mentioned are, you might say, old news. I mean, for decades, France has pursued an exceptional policy, reaching out to Moscow, whether it was Soviet Moscow or Russian Moscow, in ways not fully consistent with its relationship with the NATO alliance. And so Macron simply follows in this long-term tradition. As for Germany, there too, we've seen a decades-long tradition of Russland Verstehers, currently Putin Verstehers. The SPD has followed this policy for many, many decades. And Nord Stream 2 is a reflection of that. I think Biden, again, is very, very sensible in understanding the Kremlin challenge and competent in dealing with it. So I think we will see a more effective use of sanctions under Biden, but certainly much better cooperation with our European allies, within NATO, but also our partnership with the EU. The only partial concern I have about Biden is in his well understood desire, which I endorse, to improve relations with Germany. He may prove to be a little bit soft on Nord Stream 2. And we're seeing some indications of that now. I'm not sure these indications are solid, and some concern about this. But I think ultimately, you will not see the Biden administration cutting a deal with Germany on Nord Stream 2. One, because many people in the administration understand that's a bad deal for us. And two, because Congress will not permit it.
John, I just have to follow up quickly because I'm curious. My curiosity is getting the better of me. Let's say that everything worked out as you envision it. We impose more sanctions. We up the ante. What is your dream scenario then? When you talk about Putin Versteher or Putin understander, is the logical implication of that? So your policy is containing Russia. You're talking about an Indian summer. The country's rotting from within. Are you looking for peaceful regime change? Is that your ideal scenario?
There are people whom I respect who advocate that. That's not me. That's too much the realist in me, the true realist. If there's regime change in Moscow, I would not, no tears would be shed by me. But I don't think we need that in order to achieve our objectives. There are people who argue, and it's a legitimate argument, that Putin cannot change. Maybe that's true, but maybe not. If he sees that, in fact, if he understands how ruinous his policies are, then for mere self-preservation, he would move in a different direction, and we'd be able to reach an understanding with him. If not, then I believe I made the argument from my opening statement that Moscow is going to have to change its domestic and its foreign policies to remain a leading world power. I believe that strongly, and I believe that Moscow will be a leading world power in 30 years. But for that to be true 30 years from now, the policies which I've been describing, again, both domestic and foreign, have to change.
Dimitri, I'd like to ask you a related question, which is that the Biden administration foreign policy is necessarily amorphous right now. He's only been in office for a few weeks. But Putin has been in power now for over almost 2 decades. What is your analysis of the receptivity of Moscow elites to any American proposals? Are they gun shy, or are they looking to reach some kind of modus vivendi with the United States?
They're skeptical about US motives. They are skeptical that US domestic politics would allow a major improvement in the US-Russian relations, even if Biden wanted to go in that direction. But they also do feel that the current situation is clearly not in their interest, and that if they could come back to a model of normalcy, I think they would certainly welcome that. And Putin himself, you may say that he is a revisionist. I know that this is a very derogatory term in terms of American political rhetoric, but basically to say that our country was on its knees in the 90s, and we want to improve our situation and to have more recognition and more influence currently. I don't think that this is such a preposterous approach, as long as you don't promote it through force and coercion. I think that we have a choice between three options in relations with Russia, particularly as far as the sanctions are concerned. We may add more toothless sanctions, which would irritate Moscow, but would not bring any meaningful results. No real danger, but no real benefit too. We may introduce really sweeping punitive sanctions, and I think that most of us know what the sanctions would be, but then we would risk that Russia would respond to the sanctions the way Japan responded to the United States. Of course, Japan was defeated, but it was not nuclear age, and I'm not sure that we want to take these risks over those disagreements which we currently have with Russia, disagreements which are important but not fundamental to American interests. Or we can go back to reality and to the tradition of American foreign policy, which combined punishments, namely sanctions, geopolitical pressure, which is also in a way a sanction, and inducements. It is a combination of punishments and inducements that normally brought best results in relations with other great power. History may be back. It's up to Mr. Biden to decide whether he is prepared to join it.
Well, this suggests to me that we should reconvene in 6 months or a year and have another panel with you two to see where we're at after some more time has elapsed. But for now, I would like to thank both our panelists for their superb presentations. And I'd also like to thank the viewers who have watched until the end. You may have noticed that I went a little over time, but I found the discussion so fascinating that I didn't want to relinquish it early. So I would like to, again, thank our speakers. Thank you for watching, and until next time.
Thank you, Jacob and Dimitri.
Thank you so much.